The morning was calm, the kind of morning that made a man forget about rules, problems, and people who loved control. He had gone out early, when the mist still sat low above the surface of the lake. His small boat had rocked gently on the water as he cast his line, enjoying the silence that only a quiet lake could give. To him, fishing was not just about catching fish. It was about peace. The sound of birds in the trees, the ripples of water, the soft tug on his line when something below moved, it was all part of a life he valued. When the sun started climbing higher, he pulled in his line and paddled back to the dock. A few good fish lay in his bucket, enough for a nice meal later. He smiled as he stepped onto the wooden boards, tied the boat, and lifted the bucket with pride. For him, mornings like this were simple blessings, and nothing could spoil the feeling. Or at least, that was what he thought. He walked along the path toward his house, humming softly, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air was fresh, filled with the earthy smell of pine and water. It was the kind of day when even problems seemed smaller. But when he reached his porch, something caught his eye. A white envelope sat neatly on the wooden boards of his porch, right in front of the door. At first, he thought it was just mail dropped by the carrier, but the bold letters on the front made him pause. Homeowners Association Notice. His brow furrowed. He set the bucket of fish down and picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than normal mail, as if it carried something more than just paper. His hands grew stiff as he tore it open. The paper inside was printed with sharp black letters. His eyes scanned the words, and slowly, his calm mood shattered. Violation. Illegal fishing on HOA-controlled property. Fine. $500. Due immediately. His heart pounded. He read it again, hoping he had misunderstood. But the words did not change. A fine. $500. For fishing. He looked out toward the lake, the same lake he had fished in for years. Never once had there been a rule against it. No signs, no warnings, nothing. His jaw tightened as anger replaced confusion. Who decided fishing was illegal? And how could they claim the lake belonged to them? He crushed the paper in his fist, then smoothed it out again, staring at the fine as if the words themselves would explain the madness. But the paper stayed silent. Only one thought echoed in his mind. Why now? He stepped into his house, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He dropped the letter on the kitchen table and paced the room. His dog, an old shepherd mix, wagged its tail as if sensing something was wrong. He poured himself a glass of water, but the anger in his chest made it taste bitter. He thought back to all the mornings he had spent at the lake, the calm hours with his line in the water. The HOA had never once mentioned fishing rules before. They were strict about lawns, paint colors, even mailboxes, but the lake had always been free. His mind searched for answers. Was this personal? Or just another way for them to squeeze money from the residents? He remembered his neighbor, Mrs. Lane, mentioning she had received a warning for planting flowers that were not approved. Another neighbor once complained about getting fined for parking his truck on the street for 2 nights in a row. The HOA had a reputation for being harsh, but this was something else. $500 was not pocket change. It was a statement. He sat down at the table, picked up the fine again, and read the last line. Failure to pay will result in additional penalties, including but not limited to legal action. His lips pressed into a thin line. Legal action, for fishing in a lake that had always been open. His thoughts turned dark. Could they really take him to court for this? Could they actually win? He tapped the paper against the table, his mind racing. The more he thought about it, the more suspicious it felt. He pushed back his chair and went outside again, staring at the lake from his porch. The water shimmered under the sunlight, looking calm and innocent, as if it had no idea about the fight it had just started. He took a deep breath. He could almost hear the HOA board laughing, imagining residents handing over money without a fight. But he was not like the others. He would not hand over $500 so easily. The fine was not just unfair, it was insulting. He decided he would ask around. Maybe he wasn't the only one. Maybe others had received the same letter. He walked down the street with the fine folded in his pocket. A few houses away, he saw his neighbor, an older man named Tom, trimming his hedges. "Morning," he called out, trying to sound calm. Tom looked up and nodded. "Morning." The man hesitated, then pulled the paper from his pocket. "Did you get one of these?" Tom stopped trimming and frowned. He wiped his hands on his pants and took the paper, reading quickly. His face tightened. "You too, hey?" The man's stomach sank. "So, it's not just me." Tom shook his head. "Nope. Got mine last week. Paid it, too. Didn't want trouble." His voice was low, almost ashamed. "They said new rules were passed. Didn't want to fight them. It's easier to just pay." The man's fists clenched. "Easier? It's $500. Tom shrugged helplessly. "What can we do? They control everything around here." The words burned like fire. Control. That was what this was about. Not fishing, not rules, control. The HOA was testing how far they could push people, how much they could take before someone fought back. As he walked away from Tom's house, his mind churned. The fine was no mistake. It was a plan, and he was starting to realize he might be the only one willing to stand against it. The man could not rest that night. The fine kept circling in his head like a shadow he could not shake away, and the more he thought about it, the more it felt wrong, not just unfair but planned, like someone had waited for the right moment to strike. Early the next morning, before the sun was high, he walked again toward the lake, his eyes moving across the calm water. But his thoughts were not calm, they were sharp and heavy. He wanted to see if anyone else would be there. Maybe someone who had the same problem. At the dock, he saw a woman pulling up a small cooler, her head shaking as she looked over her shoulder nervously, and when she noticed him watching, she quickly put her things away. He stepped closer and asked in a steady voice if she had gotten a letter from the HOA, and her reaction told him everything. She didn't answer right away, just bit her lip and glanced around like she was afraid of being overheard, then finally nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone tired of fighting. $200 last month. I paid it before they raised it higher." Her words cut through him like cold air, and he realized this had been happening longer than he thought, not just to him but to others too. He asked her why she didn't challenge it, and she shook her head, saying it wasn't worth the stress. "They'll come after you harder if you resist," she said, her eyes darting to the houses on the hill where the board members lived. "People are scared of them. You don't understand." He did understand, maybe too well, and as he walked away from the dock, he felt the pressure building in his chest. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were creating fear, using it like a weapon to make people obey. Later that day, he went door to door, knocking quietly, asking his neighbors if they too had been fined. Some refused to speak about it, pretending they didn't know what he meant, their eyes shifting away like guilt was written on their faces, while others admitted in hushed tones that they had been targeted too, some for fishing, some for even walking too close to the lake after dark. The pattern became clear. The board was using the lake as their personal cash box, and no one dared stand against them. One man down the road told him that his letter had threatened to raise the fine if he didn't pay within a week, so he emptied his savings rather than risk a fight. Another woman revealed she had called the HOA office to complain, but the next day she got a notice that her trash cans were improperly stored and another fine followed. The message was clear: resist once and they will crush you twice. As he listened to these whispers of fear, he felt a heat growing inside him, not just anger now, but something stronger, a determination that this was not going to end with him folding like the rest. He could see the way people looked at him, some with pity, some with hope, like maybe he would be the one brave enough to do what they couldn't. That night, he sat on his porch, the lake reflecting the moonlight, and he held the fine in his hands again, staring at the black letters until they blurred. The board wanted silence, obedience, money, and fear, but what they didn't know was that he was not built for silence. He was built to fight when pushed too far. The whispers of his neighbors echoed in his ears as if the whole community was waiting for someone to push back, and slowly, he began to realize that person might have to be him. The man decided that whispers and rumors were not enough. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. So he began watching the clubhouse where the board always held their meetings, the large brick building at the edge of the neighborhood that most people avoided unless they were forced to attend. 4 days, he noticed strange patterns, board members arriving late at night, lights glowing behind the drawn curtains even when no official meetings were scheduled, and cars parked out front with engines running as if the owners didn't want to stay long. Curiosity turned to resolve, and one cool evening he walked down the path toward the clubhouse, keeping to the shadows, his footsteps soft on the gravel. As he approached, he could hear voices inside, muffled at first but growing clearer with every step. He stopped just below a window, the glass slightly cracked, and listened. What he heard made his blood run hot. The HOA president's voice was loud and smug, talking about how much money they had collected from lake violations, bragging that the fines were piling up nicely and that most residents paid without question. Another voice, one he recognized as the treasurer, laughed and said the lake was turning into a gold mine. They spoke of expanding the fines, maybe even charging residents for picnics or swimming, and their laughter filled the room like poison. The man clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, each word confirming what he already suspected. This was not about rules or safety, it was about greed, pure and simple. He stayed there, pressed against the wall, listening as they discussed who would be the next targets, mentioning names of neighbors who had dared to complain, mocking them as weak. The president said anyone who resisted would be drowned in fines until they broke, and the others agreed eagerly, their voices dripping with arrogance. For a moment, the man imagined barging through the door, shouting at them, exposing them for the liars they were. But he forced himself to stay hidden, because now he knew he needed more than anger, he needed proof, something undeniable that could not be laughed away. When the meeting ended, he slipped back into the night, his heart pounding but his mind sharp with purpose. He looked at the quiet houses around him, the families inside who had been bullied into silence, and he swore under his breath that he would not be one of them. As he walked home, the clubhouse lights fading behind him, he carried not just the weight of his own anger but the weight of every neighbor who had been too afraid to fight. That night he barely slept, the voices of the board replaying in his head, the mocking laughter echoing like a challenge, and he knew that the time for watching was over, the time for action had begun, because once you hear the truth with your own ears, you can never go back to silence. The next morning the man woke up with a plan burning in his head. He knew that if he wanted to stand against the board he needed more than whispers and more than what he had overheard. He needed something written, something official, something that would prove beyond doubt that the HOA did not own the lake. He made coffee but barely tasted it. His thoughts were already racing ahead as he gathered his notes and the fine letter, then drove into town where the county records office sat in a tall gray building that smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk at the desk gave him a tired look when he asked about property deeds, but when he explained that he was looking for original ownership documents tied to his lot and the surrounding lake, the clerk sighed and disappeared into the back. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, his heart pounding at the thought that maybe he was wrong. Maybe the board really did have the law on their side. But when the clerk returned, arms heavy with thick folders and rolled maps, hope flickered inside him. He sat at a wooden table, spreading the documents out carefully, scanning through page after page of legal language, lines of ink that tried to hide their meaning in complexity. His eyes strained as he traced signatures, dates, and descriptions of parcels, until finally he found it. An old map marked with faded ink, showing the lake clearly outlined, and a note that the ownership of the water and surrounding land had been tied to the original developer's house, which now stood as his property. His breath caught in his throat. The lake, the entire body of water, legally belonged to him, not the HOA. He sat back in the chair, staring at the paper as if it were treasure, his pulse racing faster now not from fear but from victory. He flipped through more records to be sure, finding confirmations in multiple documents that pointed back to the same truth, and every word felt like fuel to a fire growing inside him. The board had been bluffing all along, counting on people never checking, never questioning, and never digging deep enough to uncover the truth. He imagined their faces when confronted with this evidence, their laughter turning to silence, and he smiled to himself, a rare, sharp smile of someone who had been pushed too far and finally found a weapon. He gathered copies of the documents, carefully folding them and sliding them into a folder, treating them like a sword he would one day draw. On the drive home, he passed the clubhouse and felt no fear, only a rising strength. The lake shimmered in the distance, The same lake he had always loved, but now it looked different. Not just water and trees, but a symbol of power. A power they thought they owned, but that was his by right. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw his neighbor Tom outside again, trimming bushes as if nothing had changed. He walked over, pulled out one of the copies, and showed it to him. Tom squinted, confusion written across his face, until the man explained in simple words that the lake did not belong to the HOA, it belonged to him. Tom's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with disbelief, and he whispered that if this was true, then the board had been stealing from everyone. The man nodded, his voice firm, and said it was time someone stopped them. Word began to spread quietly as he told a few others, neighbors who had trusted him enough to listen, and their reactions were the same: shock, anger, and then a glimmer of hope. For the first time, people began to imagine life without fear of the board, life where they did not have to pay for every little thing. That night, as the moon rose over the lake, the man sat on his porch with the folder in his lap, the papers rustling in the breeze like a promise. He thought about the board laughing in their secret meeting, planning to squeeze the community dry, and he knew they had no idea what was coming. He whispered to himself that soon the truth would be louder than their lies, and as he stared at the calm water, he swore he would use that truth to turn their greed against them. The man did not wait long before taking his discovery straight to the people responsible. He wanted to see their faces when the truth was laid before them. So one afternoon he walked into the HOA office, the folder tucked firmly under his arm, his steps steady and his eyes burning with purpose. The receptionist glanced up nervously when he entered, clearly sensing the tension radiating off him. But he ignored her and headed straight for the boardroom where he knew the president and 2 other board members were meeting. Without knocking, he pushed the door open and laid the folder down on the polished table with a sharp slap that made them all jump. Their smug smiles returned quickly, though, the president leaning back in his chair with a fake grin, asking in a mocking tone if he had come to pay his fine. The man said nothing at first, only opened the folder and spread the copies of deeds and maps across the table, his finger pointing firmly at the line that proved the lake was part of his property. The room grew quiet for a brief moment, the board members staring at the papers before them, their eyes darting over the words, their confidence flickering, but it did not take long for the president to laugh. He pushed the papers back toward the man as if they were nothing more than scraps and told him the documents were outdated, meaningless, that the HOA had new rules that overruled old papers. The treasurer chimed in with a sneer, saying courts would never take his side against an organized board, and that he should save himself the embarrassment by dropping it now. The man's jaw clenched, his voice low but firm as he told them he knew the truth, that the lake was his and their fines were nothing but theft. The secretary leaned forward, her eyes cold, warning him that if he spread lies around the neighborhood, the board would bury him in penalties until he regretted ever opening his mouth. He studied their faces closely, saw the cracks behind their arrogance, the quick glances they gave each other when they thought he wasn't looking, and he knew then that they were afraid, not of him perhaps, but of what would happen if everyone else found out. The president leaned forward, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper, telling him to enjoy his fishing while he could, because soon the HOA would make sure he regretted every cast of his line. The man collected his papers calmly, sliding them back into the folder, and told them they had made a mistake, that fear only worked until someone decided not to be afraid anymore. As he turned and walked out, he could hear their voices rising behind him, nervous, angry, but he did not stop. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, but he welcomed it, because he now understood that their denial was proof of their guilt. They would not admit the truth because the truth would destroy their control, and control was all they had. When he got home, he sat once again on his porch, staring at the lake, his folder beside him. His anger no longer felt wild or scattered. It was focused now, like a blade being sharpened. The board thought their threats would silence him, but instead they had given him more reason to fight. He thought of his neighbors, the whispers of fear that filled the community, and he knew the moment was coming when silence would no longer protect anyone. The board had laughed in his face, but laughter could not change what was written on those old deeds. Deep down, he knew they were already losing, they just didn't realize it yet, and soon he would show them that their empire of fines was built on nothing but lies. The man knew that standing alone with only papers in his hands would not be enough. The board was powerful and cruel, and they hid behind fear and twisted rules. So he decided it was time to bring in someone who spoke the language of the law better than the HOA ever could. The next morning, he drove into town with the folder sitting on the seat beside him, every bump in the road making the papers shift as if reminding him of their weight. He parked outside a lawyer's office, a modest building with brass letters on the door, and walked inside with steady steps. The receptionist asked if he had an appointment, and when he explained he had an urgent matter about property rights and HOA abuse, she led him to a quiet room where the lawyer, a sharp-eyed man with gray hair and a calm voice, greeted him. The man spread the documents out on the desk, explaining the fine, the sudden rules, the whispers from neighbors, and finally the old deeds that proved the lake was tied to his property. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, reading each line carefully, tracing the faded map with a finger, nodding slowly. After a long silence, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and said the words that made the man's chest tighten with both relief and anger. The HOA had no legal claim to the lake, none at all. The fine was baseless, the threats empty, and the board had crossed into dangerous ground by trying to profit off something that was not theirs. The man asked if this meant he could fight back, and the lawyer gave a thin smile, saying not only could he fight back, but he could close off the lake entirely if he wished, because it was his property, and no board rule could erase that. The man's eyes narrowed at the thought, the idea of locking the lake from those who had mocked him filling him with a sense of power he had never felt before. The lawyer cautioned him that the board would not go quietly, that they would scream and threaten and try to twist the story, but legally, they had nothing. The man nodded, his voice firm as he said he was ready, that he had no intention of letting them steal another dime from his neighbors. As he left the office with the lawyer's card in his pocket and fresh copies of his documents in hand, he felt stronger, no longer just a single man with a grievance but a landowner with the law on his side. Driving home, he passed the lake again, the sunlight sparkling on the water as if it was celebrating his discovery. He stopped for a moment, stepping out and standing at the edge, the cool breeze brushing against his face, and he whispered to the water that soon it would be free from their lies. That evening, when he sat on his porch, he looked at the houses around him and imagined the faces of the board when they realized their game was over. They thought he would stay quiet, thought fear would chain him like it chained the others, but now he had something they could never laugh away. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind, clear and unshakable, and he began to form a plan. If they wanted to play with power, then he would show them real power, the kind that came not from empty threats but from truth written in ink and sealed by law. He pictured the signs, the gates, the moment when their greed would crash against the hard wall of reality, and a slow, determined smile spread across his face. The board thought they controlled the lake, but the truth was simple. It had always been his, and soon the whole neighborhood would know it. The man woke before sunrise with a fire in his chest, the decision made and the plan clear. No more waiting, no more whispers. Today he would show the HOA and the whole neighborhood that the lake was no longer theirs to exploit. He loaded heavy chains, strong padlocks, and bold red and white signs into the back of his truck, his dog watching from the porch as if sensing something big was about to happen. The drive to the lake was quiet, the world still wrapped in dawn's silence, but inside him his heart pounded like war drums. When he reached the first entrance path, he stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, and began his work. He wrapped the thick chains across the wooden posts, pulling them tight, the sound of metal clinking in the cool air sharp and final, then snapped the padlock shut with a click that echoed louder than it should have. He nailed the first sign in place, private property, no trespassing. The letters glared in the morning light, bold, undeniable, a wall of truth. He moved from path to path, each chain another line drawn, each sign another statement that could not be ignored. By the time the sun had risen higher, the entire lake was sealed, the entrances blocked, the freedom the HOA had stolen now reversed and locked away from them. He stood on the dock, breathing hard, sweat on his forehead, and for the first time in weeks he felt something close to peace. It did not last long. Word spread fast. By mid-morning neighbors began gathering at the edges of the lake, their voices a mix of shock, anger, and whispers of excitement. Some stared wide-eyed at the signs, unable to believe what they saw, while others began whispering that maybe the rumors were true, maybe the man really did own the lake. The HOA board arrived in a rush, their cars pulling up with squealing tires, the president storming out red-faced, shouting that the man had no right, that this was community property, that he would pay dearly for such defiance. But the man stood tall, the folder of documents in his hand, his voice calm as he told them the lake was his by deed and law, and that their reign of fines and threats was over. The board members tried to push past him, rattling the chains, tugging at the signs, but every movement only made them look weaker, powerless against the metal and ink that now stood as shields. Neighbors began to murmur louder, some cheering quietly, others laughing at the sight of the once mighty board looking helpless. The president screamed that he would call the police, but the man welcomed it, saying the law was already on his side and soon everyone would see it. The board faltered, their voices growing smaller as they realized they could not break the chains, could not tear down the signs, could not silence the truth. The man turned and looked over the crowd, his voice steady, declaring that the lake would no longer be a weapon of greed, that it would never again be used to steal from the community, and that from this day forward it was his alone to guard. The air was heavy with tension, the moment thick with change, and as the board slunk back to their cars, their threats empty, the neighbors knew something had shifted forever. The man stood at the dock, the lake shining behind him, the chains glinting in the sun, and he felt stronger than ever. This was only the beginning, and deep inside he knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time the board had been forced to face a truth they could not laugh away, and the look on their faces was worth every lock and every chain. The next days were filled with tension as the neighborhood buzzed with arguments and whispers, some people angry that the lake was locked, others secretly pleased that the HOA had finally been challenged. The man noticed how quickly the story spread. By the second evening, small groups gathered at corners, talking in low voices, pointing toward the chained entrances, and the board members drove past often, their faces pale and tight as they tried to keep control of what was slipping through their fingers. The HOA sent out letters in a hurry, filled with threats and warnings, claiming the man had broken community rules, claiming the lake belonged to everyone. But those who read the letters noticed something strange. The board never showed proof, never attached documents, just words meant to scare, and neighbors who had once paid quietly began to doubt. One woman stopped him at the mailbox, her voice trembling as she told him that for the first time she felt hope, that maybe the fines she had paid were never real, that maybe the board had been lying all along. Another man admitted that he had been fined twice for walking his dog near the lake, and now he was ready to stand up too, his anger replacing the fear that had once silenced him. The board grew louder, holding an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, but fewer residents showed up than before, many choosing instead to watch from their porches or whisper in the dark. And when the president shouted that the man was a thief, stealing the lake from the community, people didn't cheer this time, they only frowned, remembering all the times they had been forced to pay for things that never felt fair. The power of the board was cracking, and the man could see it in their eyes when he crossed paths with them, no longer mocking, now filled with desperation. Rumors began to swirl that lawsuits would come, that sheriffs would arrive, but none of it happened, and every day the signs on the lake stood tall, a reminder that their threats were hollow. Slowly, the neighbors who had once kept their heads down started to walk taller, some even smiling at him, nodding with silent thanks, and he realized that his fight had become more than personal. It was a spark that lit the whole community. The board tried one last trick, sending a letter claiming that residents who supported him would lose community privileges. But by then the words carried no weight, because people had already seen the truth in the locked gates and the old deeds. Fear was fading, and once fear is gone, power follows quickly behind. The man sat on his porch at dusk, watching children ride bikes again without their parents shouting warnings about HOA rules, hearing laughter instead of complaints, and he knew the tide had turned. The lake was locked, but in its still waters reflected a freedom the board could no longer control, and in that reflection he saw their downfall coming closer with each passing day. The day of the biggest HOA meeting arrived, and the man knew this was the moment everything would break. The board had called every resident to the clubhouse, their letter filled with bold warnings about law, property, and order, but underneath the words he could smell fear, because they were cornered and they knew it. As evening fell, the clubhouse lights glowed, and cars lined the streets as neighbors filed in, whispering, nervous but curious, hungry for truth. The man walked steadily down the path, the folder of deeds in his hand, his boots hitting the ground like drumbeats, each step echoing in his chest. Inside, the room was crowded, Voices hushed until the HOA president banged his gavel, demanding silence, his face red, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He started shouting that the man was a liar, that he had stolen from the community, that his chains and signs were nothing but rebellion. But the more he shouted, the more people frowned, remembering fines they had paid, remembering threats that never made sense. When the man stepped forward, the room grew quiet, all eyes turning to him, and he laid the folder on the table, spreading out the papers, the maps, the signatures, his voice steady as he explained in simple words that the lake was never the HOA's property, that the board had lied, cheated, and stolen money from every family sitting in that room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people leaned closer to see, their eyes widening as the truth stared back at them in black and white. The treasurer tried to laugh it off, saying the documents were old, but the man pulled out the lawyer's letter, a fresh stamp proving everything, and the laughter died in his throat. The secretary stood, her voice shaking, trying to twist the story, but the residents shouted over her, demanding answers, demanding refunds, demanding justice. The president's face turned pale, sweat glistening on his forehead, his voice breaking as he tried to regain control. But control was gone, ripped away by truth and anger rising from the very people he once bullied. The man did not need to shout, he only stood tall, his words sharp and clear, telling everyone that from this day forward the board's power was finished. The lake was his, and no one would ever pay a fine for fishing again. Cheers erupted, voices loud, clapping hands echoing against the walls, neighbors turning on the board with fury in their eyes. The president dropped his gavel, his shoulders sagging, his empire of fear collapsing in a single night. The man gathered his papers calmly, watching as the board scrambled, their threats silenced, their arrogance gone. He walked out of the clubhouse with the crowd behind him, the night air cool and sweet, and when he looked at the lake shimmering under the moonlight, he felt a deep calm settle inside him. The fine that had once shocked him into anger was nothing compared to the victory now, because he had not only defended himself, he had freed the entire neighborhood from chains of fear. The board was broken, their power destroyed, and the lake was his forever, guarded not just by deeds and documents but by the courage that had carried him through.